Hi everyone, I'm Ian Harvey, massage therapist. Today we're going to talk about the serratus muscles. There are 3 of them that we need to talk about. We've got serratus anterior, but it also has some friends. We're going to start with the anatomy review. We'll talk about kinesiology as well, and then we'll get a client on the table and do some demonstration for how I work with these thin thoracic muscles. If you'd like to skip ahead, click in the table of contents down in the description. First, let's talk about serratus anterior. It has a very broad insertion along ribs 1 through 8. You may have seen the finger-like projections on the sides of people who have very prominent muscles, and those aren't ribs sticking out. Those are the finger-like projections of serratus anterior. They go to each of these individual ribs, and they proceed back to the anterior portion of the medial border of the scapula. So they grab onto the scapula here on the front. And by using that leverage, they're able to bring the scapula forward and around. That's called protraction. If you place a hand just inferior to your armpit and thrust your arm forward, you should feel a muscle bunch up. That's the serratus anterior contracting as that scapula protracts. Just as a reminder, this is one of 2 muscles that sits between the scapula and the rib cage. We've got the serratus anterior on the rib cage side and the subscapularis on the inside of the scapula. And those 2 muscles plus some bursae are what allow the scapula to kind of float over the posterior thoracic region. Now, because of all of these individual finger-like connections to these ribs, this muscle is also useful for manipulating the ribs. So if you need to take a big breath and expand the rib cage, the serratus anterior is going to be involved. And the same holds true for these other serratus muscles. The next serratus muscle is serratus posterior superior. So it's up here. It originates from the bottom of this ligamentum nuchae from C7, T1, T2, maybe T3, and it goes down in a Christmas tree pattern to ribs 2 through 5. And again, it's using those finger-like projections going down to individual ribs, so it can assist with pulling those ribs up, allowing you to take a big breath and expand your chest. Something to note is how incredibly thin and membranous this muscle is, so you're not going to be able to palpate it, and in fact, it's deep to both the rhomboids and trapezius. And finally, we've got serratus posterior inferior, which lives down here. It comes from T11 and 12 and the top 2 lumbar vertebrae, and this one goes up, again with those finger-like projections to the bottom 4 ribs, and this can assist with depressing the rib cage, with pulling it down. So you'll notice that these all attach to the rib cage and that they all can assist with moving these ribs around as you breathe. And these can kind of be considered postural muscles. They are part of the reason why your ribs stay in the configuration that they do. And if your client does a lot of chest breathing, if they have a condition which forces them to do more chest breathing, then these muscles can become tighter and tighter, and they can be antagonistic. The lower serratus posterior can fight with the higher serratus posterior. The serratus anterior goes up and it goes down, so all of these muscles crisscross the rib cage, so if there's generally a high tension environment, I'm not going to be focusing directly on one of these muscles too much. Instead, I'm going to be thinking of the thoracic region as a whole. All right, I've got Eddie here with me today.
Hey.
So let's go over the anatomy again now that we have a client on the table. First, the serratus anterior isn't going to be especially visible while the client is prone like this, but anytime that you're interacting with the side of the thoracic region, especially as you come up toward the axilla, we're going to be interacting with serratus anterior. And again, it originates with these finger-like projections toward the front and side of the thoracic region, going all the way up to the first rib, and the insertion is deep to this scapula, so I'm touching just the very most outermost tendinous portion of the serratus anterior. I can't really do any work on the serratus anterior here, just realize that this is where that insertion is. The serratus posterior superior lives right here, right where my fingers are. This represents those finger-like projections coming from the bottom of that nuchal line, C7, T1, T2, maybe T3, coming down like this, like a Christmas tree, inserting under, so deep to the scapula. And these muscles are deep to the rhomboids and the trapezius muscle. So again, this isn't something that you're going to be able to palpate. It might just feel like a little bit of extra gristle when you're working in this area just medial to the spines of the scapula. And finally, the serratus posterior inferior. These originate from T11, T12, L1, L2, and they come up to the bottom 4 ribs. And again, these are useful for depressing that rib cage. First of all, let's talk about working with serratus anterior while the client is prone like this. I like to come at this from far away, so forget about origin, forget about insertion, and just work broadly. I'm going to come to the very inferior most portion of the thoracic region with a nice broad conforming hand and actually interact with this lateral scapula and with the axillary region. So I've got just a little bit of jojoba on my hands here. I've got my elbow tucked into my side, and I'm allowing my body weight to drive this. I've got my other hand down here supporting, and what I'm doing with this hand is providing a little locomotion upwards. If the client isn't moving at all, they might be holding just a bit. Or just having a hand here can help the client realize that it's okay for this arm to move. And so I make this a very long, sustained contact. My pressure is down toward the axillary region and angled up. So this is contacting not just the fascia around serratus anterior, but also those teres muscles and the lats. Another good reason to have this hand down here is so that I can gently pull this arm back down once I've squished that shoulder girdle up toward the head. It's no fun to have that stay there for the whole massage. If I want to get more specific, I can bring the arm down to the side of the table, place my hand directly on the side of this rib cage, and travel up toward that axillary region. I don't want my fingertips to end up in the armpit. That wouldn't be comfortable, so I am going to angle those fingertips up just a bit. And now I'm concentrating less on the lateral portion of the scapula and more on the lateral portion of the thorax. And you can bring your hand around either under or over your own arm just to make sure that that arm doesn't fall off the front of the table. But another option is to allow this arm to dangle up here, and that gives you another way of interacting with this lateral thoracic region. Just realize that anything that you do to move the arm, to change the angle of rotation of this scapula, is going to change the configuration of the serratus anterior. So it's going to feel different, and it's going to give a slightly different stimulus to this muscle. Another way of interacting with this serratus anterior is from the other side of the table, and just doing these nice, long, slow drags of this lateral tissue. You might not be able to come too far forward on people with substantial breast tissue, but you can still bring your fingers somewhat to the side and do a nice slow drag. And allow this to come from you sitting into your stance. So I'm taking a seat. I'm allowing my hands to conform to the curvature of these ribs. You can allow your fingertips to sink in between the ribs or to follow the ribs themselves to more specifically target the serratus muscle. And slowly work your way up and down this rib cage. When it comes to serratus posterior superior, anything that you do in this region between the upper spine and the scapula is going to affect that muscle. Because of that, I kind of let this other work, my regular petrissage, my regular work in and around this laminar groove, I let that be my work for serratus posterior superior. I very rarely target it directly. That said, if a client has pain that seems deep to this superior angle of the scapula, there are a lot of things that could be causing that. It could be levator scapula, it could be trapezius, it could be rhomboids, and it could be this serratus muscle. That's the reason why it could feel deep to that superior angle, because it is. So if I want to access the muscle that is deep to this scapula, I can either allow my fingers to work deep to that scapula, which is easier on some people than others, or I can have my client bring this arm up and around. And Eddie, go ahead and grab this part of the table. Perfect. So they can grab this face cradle, they can grab the table, or just whatever works for them, or you can have a stool for them. And now that this scapula is nicely protracted, work here will work more directly with these tendinous insertions of this serratus posterior superior. I just ask that you don't overdo it, especially in any one session. Make the contact, sink in just a bit, ask your client how it feels, and allow time to do this work for you. Allow the client's breathing to be a part of this massage. By inviting them to breathe deeply into their chest, that's going to change the shape of this serratus muscle, and it's going to change the rotation of these ribs. So that's going to do some of your work for you. I just ask with this specific work up here in this very thin membranous muscle to not overdo it. When I'm working with this serratus posterior inferior, I just like to come at this from a lot of angles. If I have a client who's having chronic pain in this lower thoracic region, I don't want to focus too much. This is an area that can be, in my experience, more easily provoked than other areas of the body. Too much specific work here can result in post-massage pain and even back spasm. That is not what I want. So I'm going to work with this area slowly and conscientiously. I can follow the direction of these ribs. Again, I can choose to sink in between those ribs to work with the intercostals, or to follow the ribs themselves. Just realizing that this muscle is crossing in this direction, so we're going to be doing cross fiber work here when we're pulling in this direction. We can do some pushing. So I'm pushing this direction, following the direction of serratus posterior inferior. I can create fascial traction in the other direction by pressing down toward the sacrum. And right now I'm just thinking of spreading these lower ribs. And as always, I'm not trying to break up any adhesions. I'm not trying to work out any knots. I'm just trying to give this local nervous system some more information about how these ribs can move and about what these muscles are like. I'm giving them stretch information that they don't usually get. And my hope is that by working slowly and conscientiously like this, the client will get up from the table feeling a greater sense of freedom. And that will be a very important message for the nervous system. I can also get over my client like this and press down toward the table and follow the curvature of this lower thoracic spine and this lumbar region. So I'm not sinking knuckles into the tissue. I'm using the broad surfaces of my dorsal phalanges here to create a round surface as I go down toward the table. This is a great way of interacting with QL without being too direct. And it's a great way of working with that serratus muscle, again without using any pinpoint pressure. And there's always some nice spreading. It's always good for any of these thoracic muscles. So when working with the serratus anterior while the client is supine, there are more options for working with this muscle. One, we can directly work with the origin site. Realize that this muscle goes all the way up to the first rib. Most of this is covered by pectoralis major. So we're not going to be able to see all of serratus anterior, and we're not going to be able to work directly with it. Just realize that by working with pectoralis major, you're going to be working indirectly with those origin sites. Now, all of this that I'm about to do could be done with a chest draping. I could fold it to the side and the client could bring one of their hands over to just add some support to their own breast tissue, and then I could do this work. If you'd like to see more extensive coverage of how to use a breast draping in a lot of different circumstances, I'd like to recommend a certain video from my friend Allison over at Rebel Massage. If you'd like to see that, click down in the description. So to work with this serratus anterior while the client is supine, I like to tuck my elbow into my hip, use a nice broad hand, and work with this lateral thoracic region. This time I'm going to be kind of following the arc of that serratus anterior. I'm allowing all of the power for this to come from my stance, to come from my weight. I'm leaning forward just a bit, I'm leaning against the table, and I'm leaning against my own elbow. And that is providing this forward motion. And it's making it feel, like I've talked about in the past, like a force of nature, like a crashing wave. Working with this area using small tools can feel a little unsafe. It can feel pinchy. Just be mindful if you're ever using direct, fine tools in this area. And it's a good idea, whether you're using a broad tool or a fine tool, to have a mother hand nearby. So I'm just going to place a nice supportive hand following this rib cage, compressing up toward the sternum rather than down toward the table. And you'll notice that my elbow did come away from my hip. As I straighten my arm, once again, I can deliver that pressure with my weight rather than with the strength of my arm. And feel free to come up toward the clavicle, interacting with this pectoralis major. And I'm going to repeat that. This time I'm going to come further to the side. I'm going to angle my pressure more toward the axillary region. And this time, Eddie, I'd like you to take some nice deep breaths into your chest, okay? This deep chest breathing, once again, is causing those individual ribs to rotate and this entire thoracic region to change shape and change its relationship with the scapula. And so that's going to give some new stimulus to that serratus anterior. This is contact that it doesn't usually get in a way that is very likely new for it. It's giving it new information about what it's capable of. And this is an excellent strategy for working with people with posture-related pain or just posture concerns. If they'd like to be able to easily stand up straighter, by doing this work with the anterior, lateral, and posterior thoracic region, I find in many cases the client stands up feeling like they can breathe easier and feeling like they can just stand up straighter. And we can come to the other side of the table and work with those ribs. We can follow the ribs. We can reach down toward that insertion of serratus anterior. Of course, we won't get all the way there, but that's fine. And drag up toward the origin. And again, this can be done with the arm in a number of positions. And you could add in that breathing. Alright guys, that's everything that I know about the serratus muscles. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters. I couldn't do it without you. Let me know what you think in the comments. Consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.